I wanted to speak about a topic tonight that has been often left on the periphery of our view and our understanding of the arts of Renaissance Italy, and that is tapestry. And the collection that we have downstairs is a very special example of a moment in the history of art where tapestry begins to be produced for Florentines in Florence. The Spalliera tapestries downstairs, together with a set of figurative tapestries depicting scenes of the life of the patriarch Joseph, were the first two complete sets commissioned from Cosimo for spaces in the Palazzo Vecchio, which I'm showing to you here. Those of you who have been to Florence know that this is a building that you can visit. There's a museum itinerary, and it also still holds our city government. So if you'd like to get married or argue about your traffic tickets, you can do all of that in this building. And what I'm showing you here are two black and white photographs. Unfortunately, they're the only ones that I can find that actually display the original installation of the Spalliere Grottesche downstairs, as well as the Joseph tapestries, respectively in the Sala dell'Udienza, or the audience hall, as well as the Sala del Duecento, which is the hall traditionally assigned to the meetings of the Consiglio Comunale, or the City Council of Florence. It's called the Sala del Duecento because this is the number to which that council was reduced by the predecessor of Cosimo, Alessandro de' Medici. So what we can see here, just to give you a clear idea, are frescoes by Francesco Salviati depicting scenes of the life of Furius Camillus, and below those frescoes would have been positioned on certain occasions, not always, but only for special events, the Spalliere Grottesche going round the wall this way. What you can see below is the Sala del Duecento with certain numbers of the Joseph tapestries exhibited above the wainscoting and round the doorways. These two images that you see here are the longest and largest works that are located still in Florence today. The works that we have downstairs are part of this set, and they would have continued round the walls in between the windows. And so this is in part an explanation for the varied dimensions that we have of these works. We can imagine that in a complete set they would have completely covered the zoccoli, or the dados that would have been below these frescoes, as well as the window spaces that we know were at the time also furnished with stained glass depicting the coats of arms of both Cosimo and Charles V. Cosimo is the second Duke of Florence after his fourth cousin Alessandro was assassinated at a time that the Republic and the Republican government of Florence had very recently been suppressed. This transition from Republic to Duchy was very much in recent memory of disenfranchised Florentines whose families had participated in government for many generations. So we can imagine that moving into the Palazzo Vecchio and titling that now the ducal residence would have been met with a certain amount of chagrin from many Florentines. This is, of course, a way to articulate his authority as ruler. But when we look at the iconographic programs of these tapestries and the way that they were used in the spaces of Palazzo Vecchio, we can imagine that there is something very specific at work here in Cosimo's motivation, not only to furnish the Medici court with tapestries, which are of course a very important symbol of status amongst all European rulers, but also to domesticate, in a sense, this art form, which up until the 1530s, 1540s, had still been very much considered a non-Italian art form, even if Italian artists had been contributing cartoons towards the production of Flemish tapestries. The actual making would have taken place in the north. Cosimo invites two weavers, as the ambassador mentioned, Jan Rost and Nicholas Karker, to come to Florence to not only establish workshops, but there was a condition that these workshops must also train Florentine artists in the materials and techniques of tapestry production. So, in a sense, cutting the line from the dependency on Flanders for tapestry production and setting something with a point of concern also for future generations, a workshop that would be able to employ court artists locally in Florence and also supply the courts of Italy beyond their limits. Cosimo wasn't sure how to get started. He knew that he wanted to have the leading artists of the day, his court painters, supply cartoons for these tapestries, but wasn't quite sure how the disegno of Florentine art would translate to the woven material of tapestry. And so we know that he had his court portraitist, Agnolo Bronzino, produce several cartoons for several trial pieces to be woven by both Jan Rost and Nicholas Carker. We can see the very, very first trial piece here. Like the works that we have here, which are a bit larger, these are portiere, or doorway covers, that would have been used to decorate as well as insulate spaces of the hall, working very quickly from a pictorial sort of view or landscape into something much more of the Mannerist style that we associate with the later works of Bronzino. So I think they figure out very quickly what works and what doesn't when it comes to translating these cartoon designs into tapestry. So with Joseph as a figure to illustrate in tapestries, why would someone choose a biblical figure to adorn a meeting hall of the city council? Well, Cosimo was able to see many similarities in the life of Joseph to those of his own. Like Cosimo and like the Medici family, Joseph was exiled, he was rejected, he was able to return to become a great statesman. He forgave his brothers in a way that Cosimo and the Medici hoped to forgive Florentine families that had worked towards their exile. And he's also an important figure in terms of his teachings and his morals. So together with virtues and allegories, these biblical and Greco-Roman figures really help to self-project those ideals of rulers. And this is understandable enough. We can see in the margins or the borders of these tapestries that many of the same fruits and vegetables that you'll see downstairs are meant to display the abundance and the plenitude of the Florentine state as well as the Medici family. The idea of abundance and the idea of plenitude is one that is important if we consider that the 16th century is marked by warfare, plague, famine. To have enough to really boast of your abundance is a big tool when it comes to the communication to delegates of other ruling states in Europe. Now, you can't get very far in Palazzo Vecchio without running into grotesques. They're typically painted, they cover the vaults, they cover the walls. They were executed by several generations of the Medici court following the introduction of this motif in the early 16th century. You can imagine that the Sala dell'Udienza, which we know from documents was actually used for banquets. We actually have a passage of the contract that says that these spallieri were hung in the room dove si fanno li pasti, where meals are taken, where banquets are held, that the imagery specific to the set downstairs is meant to provide an ambiance for dining, for banquets, for assembly, but assembly in a less formal sense than what we would have had down below with the Joseph tapestries. The cartoonist, or the painter, who is employed by Cosimo to provide the cartoons for the tapestries downstairs, is a local artist named Francesco Ubertini, better known as Il Bacchiacca. His earliest work, incidentally, is part of a Joseph series that is not in tapestry, another very important work, both for Florence and the city of London, the famous Borgherini bed, which incorporated panels by several important artists of the day, including Granacci, Pontormo, and Del Sarto. About 7 of those panels were also painted by a young Bacchiacca back in 1515. So again, this is probably where he's getting his career after following the workshop of Perugino as an apprentice and then meeting Andrea Del Sarto. This is what's going to eventually bring him into the attention of the Medici family. We can get an idea of how close Bacchiacca is to these more well-known figures of the Medici court if we consider a painting by Bronzino representing the descent of Christ into limbo located in the Museum of the Basilica of Santa Croce today, where many of the secondary figures are in fact hidden portraits of the Medici court artists. And I just want to point out to you here that Bacchiacca is presented right next to Bronzino. So if we consider that Bronzino and Pontormo are supplying the cartoons for this very ambitious set of Joseph tapestries, one of their very close associates is providing the grotesque designs for those that we'll see downstairs. One of the few painted works of Bacchiacca commissioned from Cosimo can be found in a room also in the Palazzo Vecchio in the mezzanine level. A small private study, or scrittoio, of Cosimo was decorated by Bacchiacca with grotesques depicting birds and plants, unfortunately in very bad condition because this was painted with oil on plaster, something similar to our problem with Leonardo's Supper in Milan. There's not much left to see, but we can get an idea of the naturalism that had made Bacchiacca so popular amongst the Medici court. We know that even for the cartoons of the tapestries downstairs and the paintings in Cosimo's scrittoio, that he loaned books, basically encyclopedias of all different types of birds and fish to the artist so that he could copy these quite realistically and employ them in the various projects of the study and the Spalieri grotesques. So we can imagine that Cosimo is quite focused in establishing his reputation and image as the ruler of the new Florentine state, as well as the continuation of what he hopes to be a long and plentiful dynasty. By the time that these tapestries are produced, Eleonora of Toledo has already successfully given 2 sons to Cosimo, both Francesco and Giovanni. So I show you a portrait of the beautiful Eleonora here by the portraitist Bronzino, but I'll remind you that that is in fact a portrait which sort of affirms the success of her fertility and insurance of the continuation of the Medici line. So when we think about the ways in which these often sort of background decorative symbols are used and incorporated in tapestries, it's sometimes nice to go back to the stories of the patrons who commissioned them to see what their expectations were for the furnishings of their environment. And I would conclude this talk by saying that the embassy is very fortunate to have such an important example of a very exciting moment of Florentine art history here in London. And at this point, it would be my pleasure to join you downstairs to view the works without further ado in person. Thank you for your attention.